everybody. I'm Hannah, and we're back with the Joseph Palombo Center for some more educational content. Today, we're continuing our series on learning disorders. So I'm here with Joe to talk about nonverbal learning disabilities. So I was thinking we start with what's the history of the disorder.
Well, thank you, Hannah. Nonverbal learning disabilities has a long history, but it's a very confusing history. And I thought I'd go over some of the elements of that history so that people can get a context of how we came to find out about it. So in 1967, two researchers, educators at Northwestern School of Education, Doris Johnson and Helen Michaelbus, were conducting some research on kids with language-based learning problems. That is, they had problems reading, writing, and they wanted to identify some of the problems those kids had. In the process of their research, what they came to was that there was a large sample of kids with those, quote, verbal learning problems, but there was a subset of kids who didn't have those verbal learning problems, but seemed to have other problems. And as they tried to identify the nature of those problems, they thought that they were due to somehow the visual processing difficulties those kids had. And they began to call those problems in social imperception. The kids couldn't read social cues, social, gestures, vocal intonations, and things like that. Now, that sort of stirred up a lot of interest among neuropsychologists, especially, and pediatric neurologists who wanted to follow up on what the underlying causes of that disorder might be. So one of the primary researchers in the field was Byron Rourke, who was a Canadian neuropsychologist. And he conducted a series of research and published several books on what became nonverbal learning disabilities. Now, not everyone agreed to that term. Some of the pediatric neurologists were trying to identify the problems as being located in the right hemisphere, the left hemisphere being our language, where most of our language processing occurs. So they thought there must be something in the right hemisphere that was interfering with the processing of information from visual, spatial, and other dimensions of our social relatedness. And so some people began to call that disorder sort of right hemisphere problems. In the midst of this, was all occurring in the 1980s and early 1900s, 1990s, I'm sorry. Yes, we're in a different century now. In September of 1992, Meryl Lipton, who was a pediatric neurologist at Rush, got interested in that disorder and decided to bring together a group of us to begin to read the literature and begin to think about the nature of the problem. So she established what was then a study group. Members of the study group were Pearl Rieger, who was a very prominent learning disabilities specialist, Warren Rosen, who was a neuropsychologist, Karen Pierce, who was a psychiatrist, and myself. So the five of us constituted really a very strong interdisciplinary group who brought a variety of experiences and knowledge. And we began to meet regularly. In our meetings, we tried to cover the literature. We talked about our experiences with those patients. And about 5 years later, in 1997, the Department of Pediatric Neurology at Rush got interested in helping us establish a center where we could do some research on that population of kids. And so Merrill was very active in getting some people to fund the center, and we got some grants. And so the Rush Neurobehavioral Center was established. She was the director, and I was the associate director when it was first established. And we began to invite families with kids with those problems to come to be evaluated at the center. We had many, many families with a variety of problems in their children who were interested. And it's out of that experience, actually, that I gathered the data for my own book on nonverbal learning disabilities. Now, part of the complication is that it isn't a straightforward kind of learning disability. It has two major components about which I will talk. So the diagnosis was that never really accepted as part of DSM-5. And so it didn't receive the kind of recognition. In addition to that, neuropsychologists are primarily the professionals who are equipped to diagnose it. So psychiatrists often don't recognize it or mislabel it as having to do with other kinds of problems like, borderline disorders or God knows some other issues. The division in the profession has meant that depending on where the family applies for help, they're likely to get or not get the correct diagnosis. Okay, so much for the history. As of now, I think the primary contributors to the literature are a couple in California, in the Bay Area. John Davis and Jessica Brightman wrote a book on nonverbal learning disabilities in 2011, which brought together a lot of the findings up to that point. And more recently, Jessica and colleagues have conducted a lot of research on the visual spatial aspect of the disorder, and we'll have a book coming out, I think, within the next month or so. I don't have the correct title of the book right now, so I can't give that to you. So where things stand now is we have neuropsychologists who are testing that. But what is lacking is substantial research in the brain functions that are involved in this disorder. I don't know of any studies of MRIs, for example, having been done on patients with that disorder. So what's lacking is the underlying neurobiology that would help us give us a more in-depth understanding of what's going on or what's causing the difficulties. So moving on to the quote disorder itself, there are two major components to it. And some people have more of one rather than the other, so that the idea of subtypes of nonverbal learning disabilities is one that I have encouraged. In my book, I talk about actually 4 subtypes. Nowadays, we think more about 2 primary subtypes of nonverbal learning disabilities. One subtype involves what we call the visual spatial dimensions of our information processing. The other is the social emotional dimension of it. Okay? So in terms of the visual spatial dimension, people with that disorder have a great deal of trouble with things like geometry, with diagrams. I had a patient who flunked biology because he couldn't process anatomical drawings. He just couldn't, see what everybody else was seeing. So that obviously impacts, the career paths that people take, and influences, some of the opportunities that people would have in choosing the career. If it's not diagnosed early, there's a lot of confusion about what is that about. Unfortunately, when kids don't perform up to expectations, there's a lot of criticism, and a number of those children, because of the impact of the criticism, develop self-esteem problems. They become behavioral problems in classroom, and the whole picture gets very muddied as to what's wrong with those kids, because in school the focus is primarily on behavior, and kids who are misbehaving, there's no recognition of the underlying problems often as to what might be motivating the misbehavior. So that's one major group of kids. The second has to do with the processing of social emotional information. Here, some of the same visual processing problems seem to be involved, in that that group of people can't process facial expressions, vocal intonations, gestures, so that they are socially very awkward. They don't respect social distance. They'll come up to your face and sort of not realize that it's uncomfortable to have somebody nose to nose talking with you. And there's a more extreme group who suffers from what's called prosopagnosia. They do recognize faces. I had one young man who was in high school, and I was having a conference with his teachers, and they were saying, what's wrong with him? Why doesn't he appear more friendly? We walk past him in the hallways and he doesn't recognize us, doesn't say hello. Why is he socially isolating himself? Well, it turns out that that young man suffered from that particular disorder, which meant that he could not recognize faces at all. So what he had compensated for when people talked to him was to recognize some other feature, like their voices, or something else about them that struck him. So when we think about that group, then we can see that that kind of what was originally called social imperception causes many, many social problems. Now, let me give you some examples of how that develops. And that's why the histories of these kids are different from those with the pure visual spatial problems. So these kids start out, they don't have language problems. They are very articulate. They can express themselves, but they get to, kindergarten or first grade, and their inability to process social information, you know, uh, they misinterpret then what other kids are saying, what teachers are saying. And so what happens is that there's a disruption in this dialogue, that we take for granted because it's like they don't understand the language of nonverbal signs. You know, what that happens, uh, there are many scenarios, but one of the scenarios that often took place in some of the kids that I saw had to do with kids would reach out, those kids would reach out to other kids, to interact with them. The other children, would respond naturally. The child would misinterpret what, the other child was doing. And all of a sudden, a fight would break out between the kids, arguments would break out. The child with the problem, with the nonverbal learning disability, would feel injured and would withdraw. Okay. So the pattern of social isolation would begin very early with those kids. And so they would have very few friends. They, were considered not only just socially inept, but often were tagged as quote, social isolates, that they didn't want to interact with other kids. Little did they know that the origin of that had to do with the injuries those kids suffered from feeling misunderstood. And it was not a primary problem, it was a secondary problem to that. So, some of those kids were identified as having, quote, social phobias because they withdrew from social contacts now to protect themselves from further injuries. Or they were identified as, quote, borderline, having a borderline disorder because they could not relate to other people. And so the misunderstanding of that particular subset of children and adults led to serious emotional problems later on in life. I saw adults who had the same disorder, and one particular couple that I remember. Again, what would happen is that finding a partner for some of these young adults was very difficult. Someone who could understand them and sort of be a good match for them. So many of them didn't have permanent relationships until later in life. And so this couple came to see me. They had met in their mid-30s. The man was the one with the nonverbal learning disability, which had not been identified. So the complaint that they came with was that, she was a very social person. She liked to have friends. She, wanted to have parties. She wanted to go socialize. And he would resist that. He would find excuses. And so there was a lot of tension in the relationship because, she was blaming him for being, antisocial, not understanding the origins of his problem. So there was a lot of marital discord. And it was only when I was able to sort of identify his nonverbal learning disability and explain what was going on, did the situation get clarified. Now, that didn't solve the issue for the wife who still wanted social relationships. And so, they settled on I think a separation at that point because their paths diverged markedly. So these are some of the problems that both groups face. Now, maybe we can talk a little bit about, what can be done. What sort of interventions are appropriate or work with people with the disorder. For the first group, I think, the major adjustment has to do with sort of, since we can't correct, the visual spatial problem, there are no techniques that can be used to reverse that. I think the effort is to direct those children in areas of strength, which are in the reading, writing, verbal expression, which are the primary areas of strength. For those with the social emotional problems, there are more avenues. I think, especially at the Rush Neurobehavioral Center, some of those were implemented. I don't know what's going on at present, but in the past few years, before I lost contact with them, they were attempting to have groups of children. Now, one of the primary goals of those groups was, first of all, to desensitize the children from the negative responses they were getting, so that they could process why others, were distancing themselves from them, why they chose to distance themselves from others, so that trying to deal with the narcissistic injuries that they suffered because of the rejection from others was one of the focus. Some of the other techniques had to do with a problem that sort of disrupts dialogue. Many of those kids don't make eye contact. Since they have difficulty reading facial expressions, their eyes would wander when they're talking to you. They're looking at the ceiling, they're looking behind you. And it's very disconcerting when people don't make eye contact. In fact, in psychiatric circles, if you don't make eye contact, that's a diagnostic of a serious emotional problem. And so one of the techniques is to help kids at least attempt to look at at people's faces as they're talking to them, so as to correct the disconnect that happens when people don't make eye contact with one another. And then there are a variety of other techniques that some very creative therapists have developed to deal with those aspects. In terms of my experience, what I have found in therapy for kids with the social emotional problems is that something happens when they experience someone who totally accepts them. Usually, when I have seen those patients, I get past all of the baggage they sort of bring, and I find myself really liking them and being very engaged with them. And for those kids, that's a very new experience for somebody to really get past all of the other stuff And so what happens in the positive relationship that develops, you know, they become engaged in trying to develop ways of communicating. And what you find after you get past sort of all of these negative things that they've experienced is that they're very interesting kids who have their own lives, who have their own interests. And so, you know, getting into that serves as a corrective to what they had experienced. So, you know, some of the kids that I have seen uh, benefit a good deal from one-to-one therapy. Um, Once, you know, they receive that acceptance, and also once they identify the kinds of problems they have, because that helps them monitor themselves and sort of undo some of the damage of their ways of interacting produced. So I'm trying to think of but what I would say is that, again, as with many of these disorders, the earlier that one could diagnose the problem, the more chances are that one could help the child undo some of the damage that occurs from the disorder not being identified. So I don't know if you have any questions or any thoughts that you'd like to share. That
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to mind is it is a NVLD more likely to be diagnosed based on gender?
we don't have any data
Mhm.
on the frequency. Um, in fact, in terms of the frequency of the disorder, by the way, it's a fairly rare disorder. You know, we think about 10% of the school age population as having learning disabilities, and about 1/10 of those have nonverbal learning disabilities. So it's really a very small percentage. Um, I have seen both uh, um, boys and girls with the disorder, so that there was no issue of the prevalence in one gender over another.
Okay, yeah. So I know that women are a lot less likely to be diagnosed with autism because they've been socialized as women. So a lot of the kind of social markers of autism are obscured because they're taught to mask really thoroughly. Is that, I know you said like there's not much data, or there isn't data about nonverbal learning disabilities, but do you think that's like a mitigating factor potentially for it not getting recognized and people socialized as women?
Well, part of the problem is that generally nonverbal learning disabilities are not recognized.
Sure, yeah.
And it's sometimes sheer accident that, you know, a kid gets testing from a neuropsychologist and it gets identified. Uh, so that's one element. The uh, I lost track of my thought. There's another element that you mentioned that I wanted to share. Anyway, so yes, those kids. Oh, I know what I wanted to say. Now, we might get into talking about Asperger's disorder in another session, but I want to bring that in because when Asperger's disorder was popular, and it's no longer a diagnosis for reasons we can discuss at some other point, there was the notion that maybe those kids who had those um, social, emotional, and learning disabilities had, quote, Asperger disorders. And there's been a controversy in the field as to whether or not kids with nonverbal learning disability belong in the autistic spectrum. That they are maybe at the early end of the autistic spectrum rather than the extreme end of the autistic spectrum. I take issue with that. I don't believe so. And in my book, I spend a whole chapter trying to differentiate, quote, Asperger's disorder, or what we would now call high functioning autism, from nonverbal learning disability. They are two distinct disorders, and it does not serve well the kids who have nonverbal learning disabilities to be identified as being on the spectrum, because that tags them, and it gets derailed. Their lives get derailed by that diagnosis, which does really they don't belong in. So I feel very strongly about differentiating high functioning autism from nonverbal learning disabilities.
Is there like potential comorbidity between autism and a nonverbal learning disability? And like, what, if that's true, if there is, someone who has both, what kind of, because we've talked about kind of the overlap of the symptoms or attributes that is the reason that it gets called autism when it's not sometimes, but what would be kind of the sign that it was both happening at once? Like what would be like the other side of the Venn diagram?
Actually, there are some studies at Yale. Clint, Amy Clint, who was a researcher at Yale, made an important distinction. Kids with autism can have a nonverbal learning profile, but kids with nonverbal learning disability do not have the autism profile. So kids with autism can misread social cues. They can have the visual spatial problems that kids with nonverbal learning disability, so that we can consider that comorbidity in terms of autism being a more complex disorder than simply, having one kind of difficulty. But the distinction is that we should not consider people with nonverbal learning disability as being on the spectrum. I'm trying to think of, in terms of other kinds of comorbidities, we don't really have enough studies to know how many of those kids have some of the other psychiatric problems, like depressive disorders, bipolar disorders, or borderline disorders. We really don't have the data to make any generalizations about those.
Okay, I think those are all the questions that I had. Is there anything, left that you want to say to wrap up, or do you feel like you've kind of covered what you want and need to cover?
The only thing I would recommend to parents who suspect that their child may have the disorder is to get a good neuropsychological evaluation. A good neuropsychologist will really identify that and, set the course for whatever treatment the child can benefit from.
Great. Okay. Well, on that note, I guess we'll finish up here. Thank you, dear viewers, for joining us. Thank you, Joe, for hanging out with me and talking about nonverbal learning disabilities. So,
thank you much.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.